Spirelli Paranormal Investigations, Episode 3. Written by Kate Beret. Narrated by Roberto Scarlato. Chapter 1. Sparkling red lights flashed in front of Jack's eyes, and his ring tightened on his finger. Red lights. Witch? Blue was spellcaster. White, healer. Yellow, lichen. Green, miscellaneous other magic. Yeah, red was witch. In his shop right now. And the day had started out with so much promise, so beautifully uneventful. He kicked his feet off the edge of his desk and headed into the retail area of the junk shop. A woman wandered in between the tables of junk, her gaze never lingering for long on any one object. Late 40s or early 50s. Casually dressed and nervous, if her darting gaze was any indication. Jack checked the register area, but didn't see Marin. "Anything I can help you with?" She turned to face him and immediately started twisting a chunky ring on her right hand. "Charlotte sent me. She said you might be able to help me. You do protection work, correct?" "Sometimes. I'm Jack Spirelli." Clearly, she knew that. But his other option, "Who the hell are you?" seemed to lack tact. Worry lines deepened on her forehead and around her mouth, making her look pinched, older. "Sylvia." She started to extend her hand, then changed her mind and clasped her hands together. "Sylvia Baker." Why did that name ring warning bells? It took a few seconds, but all of the tiny connections finally came together. He'd walked out of a former client's office with a stack of letters from her aunt. The client had been missing. The letters might have been relevant, and he'd been short on time, so he'd grabbed them and read them more than once. Jack felt a fleeting twinge of guilt when he remembered he'd stashed them in his bottom left desk drawer. Well, hell. He'd meant to return them. Sylvia peered at him. "So how does this work? How do I hire you for protection work?" "Just to be clear, you're Charlotte Sneed's Aunt Sylvia?" Sylvia's eyebrows lifted. "She mentioned me?" "You came up in the context of the coven." Jack would normally invite a prospective client into his office at this point, but the Coven of Light connection changed everything. The Coven was a batshit crazy, cult-like organization with a lot of powerful members and no love for mundane humanity. No thanks. Sylvia pulled a sheet of paper out of her purse and fanned her face. "Sorry, do you have some place we can speak more privately? Perhaps..." She looked over her shoulder in the direction of Jack's office. As he hesitated, she was a coven witch, even if she was Charlotte's aunt. Sylvia fiddled with her ring. Before Jack could respond, she lifted her hand, pursed her lips, and blew. "What the..." Jack stared at his computer screen in confusion. He'd been in the shop, not his office. How'd he get here, sitting at his desk, when his last memory was standing in the store? And who was the lady sitting across the desk from him? "What the hell? You're Charlotte's aunt." Slowly, in fits and starts, it came back to him. Charlotte's Aunt Sylvia, the Coven of Light. "What did you do to me?" Sylvia's nose wrinkled up in some combination of dismay and vexation. "You really shouldn't remember. I need to work on that one." Her eyes widened as Jack rose from his seat. No, it's completely harmless, really. Just makes you a little more compliant for a few minutes. It doesn't last, or do any damage." "Your idea of completely harmless and mine are clearly not the same. If you do anything like that again, I'll pick you up and throw your ass out of my shop. I don't care whose aunt you are." Jack glared. "Or what witchy shit you have up your sleeve." Sylvia bit her lip. "I thought you were going to send me away." "You thought correctly. That was me exercising free will, I'm a big fan of it. You've got 30 seconds. Why do I not kick you out now?
I want out, but I need help getting out of the country.
Sylvia sat up very straight and quickly ticked off the following points on her fingers.
I have excellent magical potions to trade. I can pay well, and we're stronger together than apart.
She cleared her throat.
It's possible the Coven has drawn a few conclusions and already knows I'm here.
Jack could feel his right eye twitch. Why would I believe someone, a Coven member no less, who's already poisoned me?
I need you.
Hands clenched tightly in her lap, she added,
I don't have any other options.
Why now? At her confused look, Jack said, Why are you leaving now? Why not 10 years ago, or 5?
At first, it was all about learning. I liked learning new things, and I'm good. Very good, actually.
Sylvia pushed graying bangs out of her face.
But you only go so far before the Coven asks for more. I woke up one day and realized I was mid-level management. The only way up is death magic, and there's no treading water in the Coven.
She sat up straighter and lifted her chin.
I won't do death magic.
Well, shit. Jack hated a moral quandary. That, combined with being drugged, put Sylvia right at the top of his 5 most annoying people list. But death magic? Jack only hesitated a moment before he picked up his phone and called Marin. Get your ass back to the shop and bring your go bag. He hung up before she could ask any questions, because, really, what the hell was he going to say? Sylvia sat wide-eyed, silently watching him. Okay, why spy? Wait! Jack held out his hand. Before we get into that, give me the ring. Sylvia's lips quirked.
It's empty. Really?
When Jack's hand remained outstretched, she sighed and removed the ring. Before Jack took it, he asked, How does the substance work? Through contact? Inhalation?
Contact.
Jack withdrew his hand and retrieved an envelope from his desk drawer. Once Sylvia had dropped the ring into the envelope, he said, I assume there's some way to neutralize the powder?
Dunk it in water, or rinse it under the tap.
Sylvia shrugged.
I told you, it's, not very potent.
Harmless, right? Jack shook his head. He retrieved a bottle of water from the small fridge in the office and poured it into a disposable cup, then dropped the ring in. Why did you come here? In what universe is that a good choice? Jack eyed the cup of water with the ring suspiciously.
You have connections with the Interpack Policing Cooperative, right?
Jack shook his head. Not formally. An IPPC has a strict hands-off policy when it comes to the Coven. You should know that. They won't help. Seeing Sylvia deflate, Jack said, You must have had some idea of that. Sylvia made a sound that was suspiciously like a growl.
But I'm, defecting.
She waved her hands. Jack stopped rummaging in the office closet for his second-string travel bag. Watch the hands, lady.
Sorry,
Sylvia mumbled. He hadn't repacked his go bag after the last trip, so he'd be relying on his backup. He yanked it out from under a box of crap he'd meant to have Marin sort through for the shop. He unzipped it and checked the contents. A crisp, clean scent puffed out. He ruffled through pressed, folded clothes. Pressed? He didn't press his clothes.
Does this mean you are taking the case?
Sylvia clasped her hands in her lap. Clean smells, pressed clothes. Who cared? What the hell was he going to do about the Coven? The freaking Coven. Tell me about this magic stash you're willing to trade. Sylvia brightened.
I have some exceptional specimens. I've been experimenting with the concept of portable plant-based weapons. I'm particularly fond of the exploding pomegranates, but I can't pass anything along until, well, Until we
Jack quirked an eyebrow at her. Defeat the coven? Sylvia turned red and fanned herself.
escape.
Marin triggered the ward and appeared in the office door a few seconds later. Her face was slightly flushed.
What's going on? She scowled at Jack. Why are you covered in witch magic?
The coven's after a new client, and we're leaving town. Jack picked up his bag. Marin's face was tight with some emotion.
Why does the coven want you?
Her face went blank.
You're a coven witch? I'm defecting.
Sylvia's face scrunched.
I thought I was defecting, but it turns out IPPC probably isn't interested, so I'm a refugee?
Jack? Marin drew out his name like an accusation, and her eyes turned a startlingly bright green.
Do you have any survival instincts? Seriously. The coven is into torture, death magic, crazy shit. They do not like non-magical people. Hell, they don't like anyone who's not a witch.
Sylvia stared at the wall, overtly avoiding eye contact, while she was disgusted. Oh, I tried to say no. Then I got witch-dusted. Jack turned to Sylvia. Something that won't ever happen again. She nodded so vigorously that stray wisps of her hair bounced. Jack acknowledged her agreement with a curt nod. And that's when our new friend told me we'd fare better against the coven together. Marin snorted.
And you think they'll give us as much grief if we walk away now? We pass on this job, and she is no longer our problem. The coven's not our problem. How do we even know she's really defecting?
Fleeing, not defecting. And we know because I've read her letters. Jack reached down into his desk drawer and pulled them out. He tossed them at Sylvia, who snatched at the bundle before it fell to the ground. It's all there. You have to read between the lines a little, but the discontent, the fear, it's there. Sylvia clutched the letters tight.
These were private.
Your niece was missing, and they were a potential clue at the time. Jack shifted the bag on his shoulder. But we don't really have time for this. Sylvia's from Austin, and I'm the only paranormal investigator in town, or at least the only one with ties to the magic-using community. And Charlotte was a spy client just a few weeks ago, so Sylvia's right. They could well be on their way. As they passed through the shop, Marin gave Sylvia a hard look.
If this blows up, I know exactly who to blame.
Jack stepped between the two women. Is your car out of the shop, Marin?
No, I'm still in a rental,
Marin said. Right, we'll take my car. Jack shot Marin a warning look and murmured, Not one word. Marin rolled her eyes, but didn't utter one negative word about his Jeep.
Sylvia, how did you get here? And where are your bags?
Bags, in other words, magical stash. Jack turned a sharp gaze on Sylvia. Where are your bags? But Sylvia didn't reply. She was standing in front of Jack's Jeep with her mouth parted slightly.
Is it safe?
Marin let out a rolling laugh. Jack ignored her. Definitely safe, and it runs great. Jack yanked hard on the back door to open it for Sylvia. Bags?
Oh, at my motel.
Sylvia settled into her seat, then flinched when Jack slammed the door shut. She waited until Jack was in the car before she replied,
I couldn't exactly tote them all around with me, could I?
Marin slammed her door harder than necessary. That door didn't stick. Much. You left your... Jack struggled to remember how exactly Sylvia had labeled her experiments. He groaned. Portable, plant-based weapons. You left them in your motel room?
I didn't have much choice, did I?
Sylvia made a small, annoyed sound.
I took precautions.
Jack just hoped those precautions didn't include some kind of booby trap. Pulling out into the street, Jack said, Fine. Which motel? After Sylvia provided the name, the three continued the ride in silence. Probably the best possible option at this point. because the tension was wearing on Jack. Chapter 2. When Jack pulled up in front of Sylvia's room, he was surprised to see it slightly ajar. "You did put the privacy sign out, didn't you?" Sylvia leaned over Jack's shoulder, squinting at the cracked door.
I could have sworn that I did.
Jack shared a look with Marin. He took the keys out of the ignition and handed them to Sylvia. "If we're not back in 3 minutes, leave." Jack took a breath and hopped out of the car.
Do we have a plan?
Marin, close on his heels, asked. "Not run into a water witch who can drown me in my own body fluids."
First, disgusting. Second, only the really powerful ones can do that. And third, that is not helpful.
Marin bumped into him as he paused on the stairs. When he turned around to give her a look, she said,
What?
"Do you have a plan?"
Clock's ticking. Get a move on.
Marin shoved his shoulder for emphasis. That's what he thought. But Jack refrained from comment and jogged the rest of the way up the stairs. When he got to Sylvia's door, he paused just long enough to see Marin was on his heels and walked into the room. No gun, no plan. He needed to do some life choice evaluating soon. A young woman with earbuds and a cleaning cart wiped down the mirror above the sink. She caught sight of Jack and Marin in the mirror and screeched. She clutched the Windex-drenched paper towel to her chest. Relief rushed through him. Then he realized their late-teen cleaner still looked terrified. Apparently, he looked scary even without a gun. Jack held both hands out. "No cleaning today." No luck. He glanced at Marin and did a double-take. Unnaturally green eyes flashed. He put an arm around her shoulders, whispered in her ear, "Eyes."
Okay, Honey Bear. I'll just head down to the car.
Honey Bear. And for that, he felt completely justified in smacking her ass on the way out. The snarky shit.
I'll come back tomorrow, but you need to put the Do Not Disturb sign up if you don't want your room cleaned.
The cleaner's accusatory tone left no doubt as to her feelings about the situation. Jack didn't have long to wait before Sylvia appeared in the door with Marin. "You are terrible at this." Jack shut the door behind them.
What?
Sylvia's gaze darted around the room.
You found it?
Jack shook his head. "You're terrible at being on the run. You forgot the door sign. And coming to Austin when you're from here? Not ideal."
Too late to fix that.
Sylvia's gaze darted around the room as she spoke.
Where did I put that chest?
She pulled something, a handful of dust perhaps, out of her pocket and scattered it. No more than an eye blink later, a blue plastic ice chest with a thick white lid appeared.
Besides, that's not my expertise. All of that running around and fighting and chasing, much more appropriate for a fire witch or a water witch.
Her lips pinched.
No, not my area of expertise.
Jack had a bad feeling about her area of expertise. He eyed the chest like it was a ticking bomb. Marin pressed her lips together, but clearly she couldn't restrain herself.
An ice chest? You have your magical stash in an ice chest on wheels?
Sylvia snapped the retractable handle up.
You have a better idea? I thought this was clever. A more stable temperature, easy to transport. It is very heavy, so it's difficult to get in and out of the car and up and down the steps. I took the elevator when I checked in. Otherwise, it works great.
That's great, Sylvia, Jack said. But is it safe? Sylvia patted the lid affectionately.
Of course.
She blinked.
I mean, mostly.
Jack closed his eyes. Okay. Is it safe enough for me to carry to the car?
Oh, definitely, yes.
Sylvia stepped away from her precious stash. Jack decided that was an invitation, so he took charge of the chest. As he carried it down the steps, he decided that Marin could carry the damn thing next time. It was heavy as hell. As he loaded it in the back of the Jeep, a thought occurred. How exactly did you plan to get this on your flight? Sylvia wrenched the back passenger door open, then gave him an innocent smile.
I was hoping you'd help sort out those little details, but I will be leaving a good portion of the content with you.
Exactly how much do you have budgeted for expenses? As he pulled carefully out into traffic, Jack tried not to think about what a rear-end collision would do to his precious cargo.
Enough, I think. Why?
Sylvia clutched at the big purse she had tucked under her arm. Jack tried not to roll his eyes. Do you have a large quantity of cash in your purse, Sylvia? Sylvia's lips twitched, and she clutched her purse tighter. But she didn't answer. Jesus. Okay, never mind. We're getting a private plane out of Dallas. I hope. Jack chucked his phone at Marin. Call Max and ask him to hook us up with a flight out of Dallas. Quiet, as little security as he can manage, as close as possible to an airport with a connecting flight to the UK. Jack shifted uneasily in his seat. He had an itching sensation at the back of his neck that didn't bode well. And keep an eye out for other magic users. I can't shake the feeling the Coven already has eyes on us.
I'm not picking up anyone close, but I'm on it.
Marin shot Jack a worried look, then started hunting through his contacts for Max. As Marin relayed their request to Max, Jack got on a northbound access road to the I-35, that itchy, uneasy feeling only getting worse. Max would come through for him. The guy was a pilot and had connections all over the place, and if he didn't, Jack would just keep on driving. Maybe Canada, then a freighter to England. Shit, he hoped it didn't come to that. Marin hung up.
He thinks he can find us a flight on a small private plane out of DFW area.
With no definite escape route confirmed, Jack wasn't surprised at his persisting twitchiness, but it made for an uncomfortable trip to Dallas. The DFW area turned out to be a tiny town 30 miles north of Dallas, which left Jack grinding his teeth as he weaved through miles of Metroplex traffic and dodged the homicidal Dallas drivers en route to the airport. And the flight was only so far as a private strip near Boston. But Sylvia's ice chest made it on the plane. The owner-pilot of the plane didn't even blink when handed a wad of crumpled bills in payment, and the trio were that much closer to England. All in all, a win. Jack couldn't believe they'd managed to avoid the Coven. Perhaps he'd underestimated Sylvia's stealth skills. Jack had just about convinced himself of this cheerful analysis when they landed in Boston. He was even feeling charitably disposed toward Sylvia in the taxi on the way to Logan Airport. Yeah, he should have known better. Chapter 3.
You're freaking kidding me.
Marin smacked Jack on the shoulder.
Our friends beat us here.
The cab had just pulled into the terminal's drop-off area, so whoever Marin sensed must have been waiting for the three of them. Jack scanned the slow stream of late-night drop-off traffic. A useless endeavor without his specially warded specs, since he couldn't see or feel magic any better than the next non-magical guy. Where?
Not sure yet.
Marin leaned forward from the back seat of the taxi van.
But I can feel it. My scalp itches with...
She stopped and shot the taxi driver a quick look. He didn't seem to be paying any attention. How did the bastards know about Boston? Jack gave Sylvia a look. No cell phone, right?
I already told you. No. I didn't have one before I left, and I wasn't about to get one for this. Who doesn't have a cell phone these days?
Marin asked, still scanning the travelers. Are you kidding me? You of all people, someone your age, should get that. Jack, sitting in the front seat of the taxi, waved the driver on as he began to slow. Keep going. Marin pointed.
There.
Jack pushed her hand down. Never mind, let's get out here. Right here. When the taxi driver started to protest, there wasn't room at the curb because he'd passed up the previously open spot. Jack interrupted him. It's fine. Jack shoved 100 in the guy's hand and hopped out. He fetched their bags from the back of the van while Sylvia searched the crowd for the offending coven member. Just because there's a witch here, that doesn't mean they're coven. Witches do travel a little. Marin pulled the chest out of the back. She scanned the immediate area, then said,
Like we'd be that lucky.
She slammed the hatch down, snapped out the handle on the chest, and glared at the rolling stash of magic goodies like it carried the plague, or something less curable.
We can't get this on the plane. Why are we even messing with it? And how the hell are we going to outrun them now? They know we're here.
We're in a massive public airport. What are they going to do? Jack picked up both his and Marin's bags. Sylvia and Marin shared that look he sometimes got from magic users, the one that said, Jack's an idiot. Jack shifted the bags to one shoulder and grabbed Sylvia's. Come on. As he moved to the airport entrance, Marin crowded in from behind him. She spoke in low, even tones.
A woman is approaching from the left. Mid-30s, dark brown hair, glasses, no luggage.
Got her. Jack couldn't miss her. Everyone in the vicinity had some kind of bag or purse, except the witch. She doing anything?
Gaining on us. Walk faster,
Marin said, as she almost clipped Jack's heels.
Wait!
Slightly out of breath, Sylvia tugged on Marin's shirt.
Air witch.
She heaved a breath.
Need to.
She gasped.
Line of sight.
And then she stopped speaking. It took everything she had to keep pace with Jack and Marin.
Shit.
Marin's head swiveled from left to right and back again.
That bitch witch is suffocating her, Jack. We need to get her out of sight. All of us out of sight.
Jack pointed to the food court up ahead. If he could make it that far. Sylvia was starting to stumble and gasp for breath. Jack threw an arm around her shoulders and propped her up while he pulled her with him. 3 bags, a stumbling middle-aged woman, and an aggressive air witch on his ass. He might be getting a little too old for this. They finally made it to the food court, and not a moment too soon. Sylvia swayed under his supporting arm, and her lips had a faint tinge of blue. Jack tried to get her to sit on the cooler, but she shoved away his assistance.
No.
As soon as she spoke, Sylvia erupted into a fit of coughing. Jack looked around at the handful of curious passers-by. Even as thin as the crowds were, much more of this and security would definitely show up. He smiled blandly. She's fine. Asthma. Turning to Marin, he lowered his voice and said, And the security cameras? Don't suppose you can do anything about that? Marin was kneeling in front of the chest. She'd flipped it open so the contents were hidden by the wall on one side and Jack and Sylvia on the other.
Maybe. What do you need, Sylvia?
Red. Blood.
Sylvia waved a hand and pointed, but she hadn't recovered enough to speak. Jack popped his head around the corner. Shit, pick one. She's almost here. Marin fumbled around and pulled out a red plastic container.
No!
Sylvia's hastily barked response brought forth a fit of coughing.
Flower.
She pursed her lips, mimicked blowing, and with her fingers illustrated movement away from her mouth. Got it. Marin pulled out an upside-down glass jar. Inside was a brilliantly red, spiky flower. Jack motioned for the plant, but Marin ignored him and approached the corner, unscrewing the cap as she went. She carefully pulled the glass up and away from the flower and held the cap, to which the plant was firmly affixed. Then she stepped out from their temporary hiding spot. She didn't go far, maybe 3 steps, and then held the flower up and nothing. The lights flickered for the space of a heartbeat. The next thing Jack saw Marin held a plant with a nude flower. The spiky petals lay withered at the feet of their pursuer. Jack turned to Sylvia. What exactly does this thing do? He started to gather the bags he'd dropped. Before Sylvia could answer, Marin was already beside him. She hadn't lingered to witness the result, just retreated. The color had washed away from her face.
I suspect the Coven has some way of shielding this type of mess from mundane law enforcement, but if...
She swallowed, her face twisting in a grimace.
Hopefully the cameras didn't catch anything important.
Are you okay? Jack asked. Marin gave him a curt nod, and then avoided his gaze. Message received. But he made a note to ask at some point in the future, when they weren't in mortal danger. Jack darted a quick look over his shoulder. Their tail was on the ground, heaving her guts up. Not quite projectile vomiting, but she was still making a wide-spreading, foul-smelling mess. She clutched at her stomach and heaved again and again. What does that flower do exactly? Sylvia's color had returned, but she spoke slowly, first taking a measured breath.
It's similar to food poisoning, basically harmless.
She erupted into a fit of coughing. Jack hesitated, and then put a steadying hand under her elbow. Uh-huh. We don't share the same understanding of harmless. After a few clear breaths, Sylvia picked up the pace, leaving the moans and putrid stench of her victim behind.
Very bad. Mostly non-lethal food poisoning.
She shrugged.
Harmless.
Jack thought back to Sylvia's reaction when Marin had pulled out the red plastic container. If instantaneous food poisoning was harmless, then whatever was in that container must be terrifying. Jack tried to look inconspicuous as they moved through the terminal. Easier now that Sylvia no longer appeared to be in distress. The ice chest didn't help, but they weren't drawing many curious looks.
I'm not really sure how a blown dart reached an air witch target, but one must have,
Marin said. Her color looked normal, but she still didn't look quite right.
All of them.
Sylvia's tart response interrupted Jack's speculation of what Marin had done to dim the lights, and why it had made her so ill. An image of the withered petals at the air witch's feet came back to Jack. That was one nasty plant.
They're hungry little flowers.
Sylvia spoke with a fondness that reminded Jack of an aunt speaking of a favored niece or nephew.
Clever.
Marin shot Sylvia a respectful look. Sylvia tipped her head, acknowledging the compliment. Finally, something they could bond over. Cool weapons. Jack shook his head. Giving Marin a pointed look, he said, Hey, you need to be scanning the area for the second wave. Sylvia confirmed.
She won't be alone, and that was my only blood lily.
Her lips twisted, and then she added slowly,
Some of my other inventions aren't so crowd-friendly.
Again, Jack thought of the red plastic container. Well, there are hardly crowds of people this late at night, so think about what might work if we can get them alone but in an open space. Sylvia nodded, her eyes getting a faraway look. So Jack kept an eye on Sylvia, and Marin kept an eye on everyone else as they headed to the ticketing area. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for Marin to spot the next wave.
We've got a pair this time. Maybe fire witches?
Marin hovered for a second, indecisively.
Not very powerful. Probably muscle.
Sylvia blinked when both Marin and Jack stopped and looked at her.
What? That's why you can't tell for sure, Marin. Not much juice. Well, it doesn't take much magic to start a fire, just to control its movement and the damage, Marin said. Much more dangerous in a public arena than more powerful witches. And the witch duo was, of course, in between them and the ticket counter.
All right, what can they do? Jack pulled his two companions to the side, near a wall, hopefully making them less conspicuous.
Set things on fire, control heat.
Jack interrupted Sylvia's list. Specifically to us, not the environment.
Ah, well, setting people on fire magically is harder than you'd think. Probably not that.
Sylvia's tone was matter of fact. Jack rubbed the bridge of his nose.
Yay,
Marin said in a flat tone.
not burned alive. Probably. Tortured? Definitely.
Sylvia tilted her head.
But probably no permanent harm.
Jack looked at the petite salt and pepper-haired woman. When was he going to stop being surprised by the words coming out of this woman's mouth?
Hey, guys, they're headed this way,
Marin said. Turning to the ice chest, Sylvia said,
I have two things.
She leaned in and dug around. Shit, security is headed this way too. Not that Jack was surprised. They'd lurked, lugged around a suspicious ice chest, and were now weirdly huddled.
Oh, yes, I have the perfect thing.
Sylvia shoved a cookie in Jack and Marin's hands. She took a bite of her own.
Eat, hurry up, all of it.
Immediately, she returned to dig in the chest. Marin didn't pause, just shoved the cookie in her mouth. The entire thing. Since Marin could perceive magic, its type and sometimes its function, Jack steeled himself and then followed her lead, hoping she hadn't suddenly discovered blind faith in Sylvia's concoctions. He'd barely formed the thought that the chewy center had a pleasant lemon-ginger flavor when the air filled with a fine powder. Jack covered his mouth and nose, but it was too late. He choked down the half-chewed cookie in his mouth and struggled not to gag. His nose had already filled with powder. Tears streamed from his eyes and he punched at his thigh. He was keeping that fucking cookie down. No time to think what the powder would do if he didn't. As his vision cleared, he saw the two fire witches bent over, gasping and coughing, only feet away. They'd clearly received the bulk of the whatever the hell it was. Dry-eyed and breathing easily, Sylvia calmly walked away from the group. In one hand she clenched the extended handle of the ice chest, and in the other she firmly clasped Marin's hand. Marin followed blindly, her eyes swollen and her face tear-drenched. Sylvia motioned with her head for Jack to follow. Where were the security guards? Jack scanned the surrounding area as he slowly stood upright. The guards were walking away slowly, their hands outstretched, reaching into the air. Blind? Both men moved erratically but without panic. Confused? Sylvia hadn't paused in her retreat, and she was almost to the exit doors when she called over her shoulder,
Jack, we are leaving?
Jack trotted in her direction, their bags banging against his side. He nodded as he chuffed out a hoarse breath. He couldn't cough. Once he started, he wouldn't stop. His throat burned with his efforts to hold it in. When he reached Sylvia and Marin, he turned to see their fire witch friends recovered enough to see them walk through the exit door. Shit, they saw us leave. What the hell was that?
Devil's weed.
Sylvia tipped her head.
Tweaked slightly.
Marin dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve.
More than slightly. That's some powerful shit.
Sylvia raised her hand to flag a cab.
But not lethal.
She frowned as a cab pulled up. She turned to look at Marin.
You must be very young for your eyes to be so sensitive.
A low growl emanated from Marin's vicinity, but she didn't say anything as she packed the ice chest into the taxi's trunk. Jack dropped their bags in next to the ice chest. Well, at least you have lungs of steel. Jack hopped into the cab after Marin. Lowering his voice, Jack asked, What exactly does your devil's weed do? Keeping her voice low, Sylvia said,
Confusion, temporary memory loss, hallucinations. My potion's not lethal. I made sure.
The last was added in an earnest tone. Since everyone had been alive when they left, Jack figured she had made sure, but that the question even came up was telling. About Devil's Weed or about Sylvia's potions, he wasn't sure. Where to? The cab driver interrupted them and shot the trio an uninterested look over his shoulder. Jack rolled his shoulders, trying to think of a good escape route. He didn't know Boston.
Someplace central, public, lots of space, Marin told the driver. And not far.
The first glimmer of interest sparked in their cabbie's eyes. Boston Common? It closes at 11:30, but that gives you an hour or so.
That works.
Marin dropped back against the cushion of the seat.
You don't have a phone. Do you have any kind of electronic device, Sylvia?
Something with GPS signal, specifically? Jack added. He and Marin both turned to look at Sylvia. A perturbed look crossed her face.
I've already told you, no. But how we managed to fly into Boston of all cities.
She gave both Jack and Marin an annoyed look.
Boston? It's a hotbed of coven activity.
Jack closed his eyes. Very slowly, he said, Now you tell us.
How am I supposed to know what information you do or don't have?
Sylvia's aggravation leaked into her voice, raising it somewhat.
All right, Marin said sharply. Boston's not the best choice, but it was the one option we had at the time. We need to figure out if the Coven has some way to track you, or if they've just been incredibly lucky. What did you bring with you?
Sylvia took a deep breath.
What I'm wearing, my bag, some toiletries, 3 changes of clothes, and the ice chest filled with my projects.
Your purse? Jack reached a hand out. Sylvia passed him the large bag she'd held clutched against her chest.
If there's nothing, it might be a geolocator.
Marin wrinkled her nose and scrunched up her eyes. That would suck. Jack looked up from rummaging in Sylvia's purse. That would suck.
Here.
Marin took the purse and dumped its contents in between her and Jack. She examined the empty bag and then plopped it down in Sylvia's lap. Marin rummaged through the items, replacing them in the purse when she was done with them. A small toiletry bag, a nightgown, a sandwich, a veggie juice drink, a wallet with no personal photos inside, an envelope with a wad of cash, and a small notebook with a fancy pen tucked into a holder on the side. When all the items were once again in Sylvia's bag, Marin said,
Nothing looks suspicious.
Sylvia hugged her arms close.
Of course not. I checked. My bag and the ice chest, too. There's nothing that has the taint of another witch's magic.
Hey, we're almost there. Any place in particular you want to be dropped? The cab driver didn't even bother to look back when he spoke. Apparently, the little trio had lost their driver's interest during the uneventful trip. That was one piece of good news. Their driver must not have gotten an earful.
No, Marin said. Anywhere's fine.
He didn't acknowledge Marin's response, but he did pull over about 2 minutes later. Jack was curbside, so he hopped out and went to the front passenger window to pay, while Marin grabbed their bags. Jack handed the cabbie a 50. The driver hesitated and then said, One piece of advice. You want to avoid the coven. You ditch the witch and leave Boston as soon as you can. Jack looked at the driver closely for the first time. Deep wrinkles etched grooves in his tanned face. Dark brown eyes peered out from beneath shaggy white eyebrows. Then the cab was gone. Jack turned around to see Marin and Sylvia looking equally perplexed. Marin shook her head.
Don't ask. He felt human to me.
Jack finally turned his attention to the park and got his first look at Boston Common. Holy shit! How big is this place?
Big. Let's get rolling. I don't want to stand around on the street with a huge sign that says, Coven of Light, come take me now.
Marin turned toward the common, but she turned back when they didn't immediately follow her.
We just need a spot to sit down and figure out next steps. Preferably where we can see them coming.
Sorry, Jack mumbled. He couldn't move past the taxi driver knowing about the coven, and Marin was already tackling the next problem. He wasn't exactly on his game. They entered the common on a well-lit path, the ever-present ice chest rolling along behind. Chapter 4. Jack, Marin, and Sylvia traveled down the common path at moderate speed. Much more, and Jack couldn't miss the strained breathing sound Sylvia made. Since he didn't particularly want to carry her, they kept to a speed that Jack found teeth-gratingly slow. He couldn't help but imagine the hot breath of coven pursuit on his neck.
Hello?
Sylvia caught up the few feet she'd lagged behind.
I think... Yeah, they're here. I can feel them.
Marin's terse statement jerked Jack up short.
How the hell did they find us?
But if Marin or Sylvia knew the answer to Jack's question, they'd obviously have said something long before now. A plan. He needed to move forward. How far? Marin turned to look behind them, walking backward down the path for several steps. She scanned the surrounding area.
Nothing I can see. You really want to avoid line of sight with most witches.
Sylvia supplied this information in a helpful tone. Yeah, I'm getting that. Jack stopped. A plan. He laughed and shook his head as the cab driver's words came back to him. Marin gave him a nasty look. Her frustration was palpable.
On a timetable here, Jack.
Our cabbie was brilliant. Ditch the witch and leave Boston. Jack surveyed Sylvia and her gear. No jewelry, the clothes on her back, the purse he'd already gone through, her bag, which they hadn't yet made time to search. Ditch the bag and strip off your clothes. Marin hesitated just a hair and then lifted the bag she'd been carrying for Sylvia ever since they'd left the cab.
Wait!
Sylvia grabbed the bag.
My letters,
she explained as she rummaged through the bag. She pulled them out and shoved the bundled stack into her purse. Marin yanked some jersey shorts and a t-shirt out of her bag.
My PJs will have to do.
She scanned the area for passers-by, then said,
Quick, before someone comes along.
Jack turned his back and alternated between studying the map he'd pulled up on his phone and keeping an eye out for anyone walking up the path. There were just enough trees that you couldn't see into the distance, so no line of sight, but it was hardly heavily wooded. He could just imagine explaining to Boston PD why they'd been hanging out with a naked woman on a public path.
All right,
Marin said. When Jack turned around, Sylvia was dressed in navy knit shorts that reached to just above the knee and a bright green shirt. Oversized flip-flops covered her feet. She leaned down and picked through the contents of her purse, now dumped on the ground. She huffed out a harsh breath and then shoved the cash and the letters into a reusable cloth shopping bag that Marin must have provided and left the rest.
Whatever you're going to do with this stuff, do it now.
Marin caught Jack's gaze.
They're close.
Sylvia rummaged in her ice chest.
I'm developing a love-hate relationship with that thing.
Marin eyed the chest suspiciously. Sylvia pulled out a glass flask that had been bubble-wrapped.
Oh, maybe we should move them to the path. I don't want to kill the grass.
Marin rolled her eyes.
I could have set them on fire.
But she quickly moved the items onto the main path in a tidy path. Jack bit back the natural response. Why didn't you? Because, really, he should have thought of that himself. Sylvia shooed them away, then tossed the flask on the pile from about 3 feet away. As soon as the glass broke, the entire pile blazed with bright flames. She briskly walked away, grabbing the ice chest handle as she passed it. As the threesome walked away, Jack looked around at the green grass, the trees, the fuel that surrounded them. Are we going to be reading tomorrow about the common going up in flames? You can't tell me that stuff was harmless.
Mostly harmless. A little creosote brush and torchwood powder won't set the park on fire.
Sylvia winced and limped along for a few feet. Ill-fitting flip-flops weren't exactly the greatest footwear for a woman on the run. Jack grabbed the chest handle from her.
Yeah, but we're talking magically enhanced torchwood. I'm guessing the regular stuff doesn't burn when exposed to air. Seriously, Jack, I hope you had more in mind than getting rid of Sylvia's gear, Marin said. For all we know, her ice chest is bugged. Or she is. No, I don't think that's possible. The ice chest is a last-minute purchase and wasn't out of my sight before I left. And you can't bug a person without them knowing.
Sylvia huffed a little, trying to catch her breath.
I don't think.
Jack could only think of a few possibilities. He grabbed the handle of the retracting handle of the chest from Sylvia. The entire city is warded, or...
No way, Marin said. Las Vegas was a bizarre anomaly from everything I've heard, and impossible to miss when you passed through the ward. And don't forget, that's big spellcaster magic. I don't see any coven members playing well with local spellcasters.
That was an understatement, considering what happened to 2 coven members who'd recently tried. Jack wouldn't soon forget the sight of a man drowning in his own body fluids. Yeah, what about a geolocator? Sylvia stopped to catch her breath.
Where are we headed?
Park Street Station, Jack said, glancing again at his phone. Shouldn't be much farther. Marin handed Jack her bag.
Come on, I'll give you a ride. I'm sorry?
Sylvia blinked at her in confusion.
Piggyback. You must have done it as a kid. Come on.
Marin couldn't hide the grin spreading across her face as Sylvia grabbed hold of a bunch of t-shirt to stabilize herself. Sylvia's discomfort was clearly cracking her up. Jack gave Marin a narrow-eyed look. Whatever, they're still back there checking out the pile of ash we left. Once Sylvia and Marin had figured out the dynamics of piggyback transport, and they were headed to the station again, Jack said, So, geolocator? Do we think that's a reasonable possibility?
Oh my, that would be bad.
Sylvia seemed to have gotten over her embarrassment. Now her attention was focused primarily on not losing her flip-flops, as Marin trotted along at a good clip. Jack tried not to shake his head. Surely Boston Common had seen weirder things.
Any chance you know how to block a geolocator?
Sylvia sounded a little huffy.
We don't know how to keep you from being tracked by a geolocator or anyone else, but at least if we can figure out how they're doing it, we can try. So I'd say that's a good next step.
Marin managed to reply and shift Sylvia around to a more comfortable position without slowing. Thank God for dragons. And maybe he should up his running schedule to 4 times a week. I'll call Harrington and see what he knows. We need to ditch you metaphorically, make you look like you've disappeared, preferably like you've died. Then we quietly slip away home while you travel on to England. Because at this point, they'll be looking for you wherever Marin and I go. Sylvia's eyes got big.
You're going to kill me off?
Before Jack could assure her that they weren't actually going to off her, Sylvia said,
Why didn't I think of that?
The subway station finally appeared, not much further.
Thank God.
Jack unclenched teeth that felt cemented together. Marin gently lowered Sylvia to the ground at the entrance of the subway station, and Sylvia had even managed to hang on to her flip-flops. Jack checked the schedule on his phone. 5 minutes, if it's running on time. How close are they? He started to dial Harrington's number, but paused before connecting, waiting for Marin's answer. When she didn't reply, he looked up. Marin stood completely still, facing the direction they'd just come from. Her stillness was so complete, Jack could feel the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He rolled his shoulders. He shouldn't let her creepy dragon shit get to him. He couldn't believe that it still did. Finally, Marin turned around.
I think we lost them. They're not getting any closer. Maybe we ditched the tracker? There were at least 3 or 4 turnoffs between here and there, Sylvia said. And witches can't track like lichen. or dragons.
Marin frowned in response, but didn't correct Sylvia's misperception that dragons could track by scent. Jack didn't get why the lichen-dragon scenting comparison bothered her so much. Addressing Jack, Marin said,
Do you have an end destination in mind?
"If we've lost them, I'd love a crash pad." As he spoke, an unengaged cab rolled by. Jack flagged him down. "If they're not on our heels, we're getting a room. You're sure?"
Cautiously, Marin said, I can't sense any magic users in close proximity.
Sylvia's mouth twisted.
I could really use some sleep, if we think it's safe.
Enough with the sleep talk already. Marin stifled a huge yawn and threw open the door of the cab that had rolled to a stop in front of them. Sylvia got in first, and as she pushed through to the far seat, she said,
Know of a motel outside of town that takes cash?
The driver's answering grunt must have meant yes, because she pulled out into the road as soon as Jack closed the door. As the cab pulled away from the curb, an uneasy feeling crawled up Jack's spine. Their escape had been too simple, and the loss of their coven tale much too easy. Much as he hated to keep falling back on Harrington, he was Jack's best source, and Jack had to figure out how the coven had been tracking Sylvia. Otherwise, how was he going to kill her off? Chapter 5. Jack closed the bathroom door of the cheap room he, Marin, and Sylvia had just checked into. He'd gone with something outside of town in the hopes of escaping the Boston hotbed of witches. He flipped the cover of the toilet down and planted himself on the seat. Before he could talk himself out of it, he dialed Harrington. Harrington picked up on the second ring. "How can I help you, Jack?" Jack cringed. He already owed the guy one favor. "I might be able to help you out. I've got access to some recently developing intel that might interest you." "In exchange for?" And here was the tricky part. Trying for a casual tone, Jack said, "Information for information. I could use a little background on magically tracking a person." Harrington's response was immediate and sharp. "I'm not putting you in touch with Cliff." Jack shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position on the hard seat. "I get it. I'm not asking for your precious geo-tracker. Just some information from you." "Done. What have you got?" "A coven witch on the run, headed your way. Well, headed IPPC's way to London. Not sure where she'll end up, but she'll be passing through London." "Jack," Harrington chided, "you know we can't help. We have a strict non-interference agreement." "Right. I'm not asking you to interfere. I'm letting you know she'll be in the area and, more than likely, open to answering some questions, if you have any." Jack shifted the phone to his other ear. "Or not, if you don't think she'd be useful." "When?" Just as Jack expected. Harrington couldn't pass up commitment-free intel on a rival organization, regardless of whatever non-interference agreements the two groups had in place. "Not sure yet when she's landing, but I can update you." There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Finally, Harrington said, "Agreed. What do you want to know about tracking?" "What methods are there? And is there a way to block them? Hypothetically, I'd like to make someone untrackable." "You know about geolocators. As you're already aware, there's a way to tag a person or object so that a geolocator can still actively track them from a distance. Then there's scent tracking." "There's been no evidence of lichen," Jack said. "Lichen aren't the only magic users capable of scent tracking, but they do all utilize basically the same principles. Could you have been tracked by scent?" The tapping of keys in the background punctuated Harrington's response. "Doubtful. Maybe in conjunction with some detective work and some other magical means, but not alone. Any hints for finding a geolocator's tag?" There are no electronics, no phone, no computer. Jack couldn't help but hope they destroyed whatever tag might have existed when they destroyed Sylvia's gear. Well, tracking through technology requires a gifted geo-tracker. You know they're rare. Fire is good if the tracking device is an object, but if the subject has ingested the marker and it's been absorbed into the subject's system, then only time will dissipate the signal. Jack closed his eyes and let his head fall forward. How long? 2 days? 3? No more than 5 at the most. Shit. Wait, Jack said. Wouldn't Marin have picked up on the magic? Possibly with an item, but if it had a relatively weak signal and she didn't know exactly what to look for, maybe not. Harrington tapped away on his computer. After a few seconds, he added, and even less likely with an ingested tag. So it's likely there's a geolocator involved. How the hell are we supposed to hide from someone whose gift is finding people? Jack rubbed at his temple, where a nagging throb had begun. Harrington muffled some noise that sounded suspiciously, like a laugh. Then the typing in the background started again. My source doesn't think there's much talent locally. If a geolocator is involved, they're close. Wait a second. Are you IMing with Clifford? Jack couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. Harrington made a non-committal noise. That bastard! When I went looking for him, he didn't have a phone, let alone a computer. Jack couldn't help a huff of laughter. Good for him. He sends his greetings. Jack smiled. Cliff was a funny little guy, and it was good news he was crawling out of his hole, well, his Welsh fortress castle prison, even if it was only virtually. So, exactly how far does Cliff think the local talent could stretch? 10 or 20 kilometers? But it's possible he's underestimating. He seems to think the local talent barely qualify as geolocators. Jack considered the logistics of a short-range tracker. Best guess, the Coven had used some old-fashioned detective work to track them to Boston, and once there, the fleeing trio had stepped into a web of Coven contacts, so their tracker could easily be in Boston. An escape plan was slowly forming. What about blocking? Scent, geo-trackers, whoever might be looking. Jack stood up and stretched out his back. You need a spellcaster. A decent spellcaster. Of course he did. In retrospect, Jack couldn't believe his luck when Marin walked in the junk shop just weeks ago and asked for a job. But damn, a spellcaster would be handy. Anyone reliable in the area who would consider subcontracting? Jack asked. You're in Boston, Jack. A heavily Coven-inhabited area. Any remotely trustworthy spellcaster will be well outside the city. I think we've got a few contacts in the vicinity. Harrington typed away on his computer, but it didn't take him long. I can give you 3 names, but... I know. IPPC didn't refer me, isn't asking them to help me, and generally has nothing to do with any of this. Harrington sighed, audibly. Correct. Jack opened the bathroom door, and as he walked out, made a writing motion at Marin. I get it. Go ahead. Marin handed him a piece of paper and pen, and Jack jotted the 3 names down. Where are they? Salem, Harrington said. Outside the city limits, but not far by rail or ferry. You're kidding. Salem? Jack underlined the word Salem on the scrap of paper several times. It's not a witch-friendly town, in part due to its history, and that has made it somewhat welcoming to spellcasters. It's not exactly a thriving community. It's too close to Boston, but it's close. I thought you weren't particularly well informed when it came to the Coven and witches in general. Improving intel has been a recently added objective. The information and the contacts are good. Harrington's tone was terse. You'll update me with arrival information? Yeah. Jack pocketed his phone. Typical Harrington. No goodbye. Jack retrieved the scrap of paper off the dresser, headed to the sofa, and collapsed in a heap. He was exhausted. I've got the names of 3 local spellcasters. With any luck, one of them will bite on a paying job involving a witch. A coven witch, Marin said. They both turned to Sylvia. Curled into a ball on her side, she dozed on top of the covers, still clothed in Marin's t-shirt and shorts, the flip-flops abandoned next to the bed. You look like crap. Take a quick nap, and I'll try to sort out a meeting with one of these guys. What exactly is it that we want? Marin rummaged first in the dresser, and then the closet, where she pulled out a blanket. She threw it at Jack. A shield from tracking. Most likely a low or mid-level geolocator is involved. Jack shook the blanket out and tipped his head back against the cushions. Or some other tracking method that's completely unknown to you, me, and the IPPC. Right. I'll leave that part out, why don't I? Marin picked up one of the key cards they'd been issued. I'm going to grab a few snacks from the vending machine before I call. Be right back. Jack grunted and pulled the blanket higher. He must have slept soundly because the next thing he knew, Marin was shaking him awake. She shoved a small paper cup of coffee in his hand as soon as he sat up. God love her. Thanks. Jack downed half the cup in a few swallows. The coffee was still hot, so he hadn't been out long. He glanced at the bed and found Sylvia still asleep. What have you got? An appointment. Marin pushed aside a packet of cheese crackers, a bag of chips, and some jerky to retrieve the scrap of paper he'd given her earlier. There was an address scribbled next to one of the names. Jack, I recognized one of the names. A guy who used to do some work for my dad every once in a while. I called him. Jack took a sip of coffee, hoping it would settle the churning in his stomach. Where would he be without Marin? It was getting ridiculous how much he relied on her. He chugged the rest of the coffee. Right. How long do we have? We need to leave in 5 minutes. We're meeting in Salem. Jack scrubbed his hands across his face. All right. Give me a few minutes in the bathroom and wake up Sylvia. Jack, Marin, and Sylvia huddled around a table at a small Salem coffee shop. Warm drinks clutched close as they waited for their spellcaster to show. Jack eyed the door, waiting for the mysterious spellcaster Arthur to show up. When a small, unassuming older man walked through the door, Marin tapped the ring on her middle finger against the table. Jack nodded at her, then stood up and motioned to him. Extending his hand, Jack said, Arthur, we appreciate you meeting us this early. Arthur shook his hand with surprising firmness. It's all right. I don't sleep much these days. You, Jack? When Jack nodded, Arthur turned to Sylvia with a questioning look. Sylvia, thank you for your help. She pumped Arthur's extended hand with an excess of enthusiasm. Arthur smiled politely at Sylvia, without judgment as far as Jack could tell. When Sylvia eventually released his hand, he turned to Marin, and a broad smile spread across his face. Very nice to finally meet you. Greetings to your dad. After they'd all settled into their seats again, Arthur clasped his hands on the table. You need to make someone untrackable? Sylvia raised her hand, a sheepish expression on her face. That would be me. No idea how they're tracking you? Arthur's eyes narrowed, and he raised his hand. Don't answer that. Arthur studied Sylvia for several minutes. So long that Sylvia started to shift uncomfortably in her seat. Eventually, she clasped her hands and stared fixedly at them. Arthur reached over and placed a hand on top of Sylvia's. Nothing too complicated. You must have eaten a warded item. Seeds work nicely, and beans, especially raw. It would have been within the last few days. Can you think of what... Arthur removed his hand and leaned back in his chair. Sylvia's lips had thinned, and her face tensed. You know what it was? Arthur asked. When she hesitated, he said, Or you suspect?
Sunflower seeds. A friend.
Sylvia cleared her throat.
Another coven witch brought some by a few days ago. I had no idea.
She gave her head a small, firm shake and attempted a smile.
I know what they're like. I'm not sure why I'm so...
She shook her head again. Well, the seed is long gone at this point, but with a tracking ward, a person only has to ingest it for the ward to tag them, Arthur said. After consumption, it's simply a matter of how much juice the geolocator invested in the tag. I'm guessing not much. The duration of the tag is affected by the magical energy attached to the tag. The distance the subject can be tracked is a function of both the magical energy attached to the tag as well as the talent of the tracker. As Arthur detailed the exact nature of geotagging, it occurred to Jack that the man had a great deal of information. Jack didn't want to alienate their newfound and very informative source, but once his suspicions were raised, You know a lot about geotagging.
Arthur's partner was a geolocator.
Marin mouthed, Sorry, to Jack. Jack made a mental note never again to nap and leave Marin in charge. Ever. And a reminder to smack himself when he wasn't so damn tired. Before Jack could feel like crap for not apologizing, because he wasn't about to, Arthur had picked up the narrative again. As I was saying, this tag has neither great distance nor great duration. Not surprising, really. Not much local talent. Arthur's gaze drifted away, unfocused for a moment, then he seemed to collect himself. By locally, I mean in the States. We don't have much geolocating talent. Wales, the East Indies, a sprinkling in Australia and New Zealand, that's where the tracking talent is. And a few outlier pockets scattered here and there, of course.
We appreciate you coming out of retirement for this, Arthur.
Marin shot Jack a warning look.
Any chance you can give us some specifics, a timeline, a range?
Sylvia, looking confused, said,
How do you retire from spellcasting?
Arthur smiled and a lightness overtook his features for the first time since they'd sat down. I suspect in much the same manner you're leaving the coven. He tilted his head to the side. Without the life-threatening flight. I moved and didn't connect with the local community, what little of it there is. But back to the matter at hand, before the young man has a coronary. 2 days, at a guess, before your tracking tag fades. But that's immaterial. I can create an invisibility ward that extends well beyond your tagger's talents. Sylvia's eyes went wide.
But I won't be actually invisible? I've never heard of such a thing.
No, not invisible. If you want to be untrackable, that's an invisibility ward. You'll be hidden from the nosy folk, geolocators, and, on a more limited basis, from lichen and other scent trackers. Arthur waggled gray eyebrows at them. I'm very good at invisibility wards. Not many spellcasters are. Jack found himself smiling even though he was pretty sure they were sitting ducks in the cafe, and he was pretty sure he'd be on a coven hit list after this. Arthur was likable. Speaking of being sitting ducks. It's been about 2.5 hours since we last ran into the coven. We thought we'd destroyed whatever was tracking Sylvia. But now that we know we didn't, how exactly did we manage to evade them for that long? An unreliable local tracker, maybe. Perhaps you ventured outside the tracker's range. Arthur gave Jack a sad smile. You'd never have shaken Francis, my partner. Francis was a gifted tracker, one of the best. He was Welsh, of course, not American. A heavy silence followed. Clearly, Arthur had lost his partner, and just as clearly, he'd been devoted to the man. Arthur cleared his throat. So, I'd guess that either luck or an incompetent tracker might have helped you along. Sylvia rubbed her eyes.
Thank the heavens for the Coven reluctance to associate with other magic users. They probably have no idea their tracker is subpar.
She tipped her head.
Though I suspect they're learning, and he won't outlive this particular assignment.
Jack shook his head at her callousness. Yeah.
On the off chance that your pursuers have managed to track you through other means to the area, I've set up some security for our meeting this morning. I scrambled the geotag. It will read like Sylvia's popping in and out of range. I didn't want to mask the tag entirely.
Arthur lifted both hands in casual gesture.
Without knowing your plans, it seemed the safest course of action.
Arthur, you are a gentleman and a scholar. Jack leaned forward. Here's what I'm thinking. Sylvia, you have to disappear before you leave the country. And the best way to make sure you disappear is to kill you. Sylvia clapped her hands together.
I love it. If I'm dead, no one's following me. It's perfect.
Arthur nodded.
I can ward a piece of jewelry or clothing. It's easy enough to make a ward that activates when it's worn. Then once you've been killed off officially, you can trigger the invisibility ward.
Marin removed a ring from her left thumb, a simple silver band she wore most days, and handed it to Arthur.
Will this work?
Arthur took the ring, examined it briefly, and nodded.
But how do we kill me?
Sylvia asked. That was the question. Chapter 6. Jack scanned the small outdoor area. He hoped sticking around in Salem had been the right plan, that this was a good place to implement their plan. He rubbed his temple, hoping the looming headache would fade. At least Salem had to be better than Boston.
Jack, this is important.
Sylvia held up a glass container.
These aren't labeled.
Jack pulled his attention back to the small table where Sylvia had placed a few of her potions. He couldn't help it. The crawling sensation on the back of his neck was telling him something wasn't right. I got it. The round chemistry set-looking flask is fire. The peanut butter container has glitter that sticks and burns. The test tubes with the corks fluoresce after they've been shaken. Sylvia closed her eyes and inhaled slowly.
Vigorously shaken.
When she opened her eyes again, Jack said, Vigorously shaken. Got it. So I'm a little distracted. Can you blame me? She sighed.
No, but you need to know what each of these containers holds. And the peanut butter jar isn't glitter. Those are small seeds. Don't let them touch your skin. They won't actually burn you, but any contact and you'll feel like you're on fire.
Sylvia fiddled with the material of her new skirt, bought a half-hour earlier from a small boutique they'd stumbled across as they'd put their plan in place.
I can't believe they didn't catch up with us while we were shopping.
Jack glanced at his phone. Almost noon. Exactly how incompetent is this tracker? Sylvia raised her eyebrows.
Maybe Arthur's scramble was better than he intended, or they had to dig deep for some better evil henchman talent. Whatever the reason, my feet are grateful. Those flip-flops were terrible.
Marin appeared, a large takeout bag in one hand and a felt marker in the other. She handed the marker to Jack.
Great. Like the regular bad guys weren't bad enough. My vote's for Arthur. He probably tied their geolocator's antenna in a knot.
Jack passed the marker to Sylvia. She shook her head, but took it.
It's important you understand how each of these works.
She started to carefully print instructions on the glass and plastic containers. Jack took a bite of his burger, while Marin pulled out the rest of the food. He had a handle on the contents. Then he remembered the Instafire. A little caution was warranted. He turned to keep an eye on Sylvia's scribblings. Marin stuffed a fry in her mouth.
Let's hope the supervillain angle is crap. I might be a traitor, but I'm still a witch. The run-of-the-mill coven member may have no qualms about performing death magic on humans.
A deep furrow appeared between Sylvia's eyebrows.
And others, but not witches. If you're drinking the Coven Kool-Aid, you believe witches are a higher form of being. Long story short, they may have more limited resources than appears at first glance, Marin said, and shoved another fry in her mouth. Sylvia nodded. But I'm pretty sure we haven't worked our way through Boston's squad of enforcers or upper management, all of whom would happily see me dead. Jack had picked their outdoor location for visibility and ease of escape. He just wasn't planning for them to escape very far. All we need is one of them to make a move. If they're much longer, we'll have to move to another spot. We don't want to broadcast the plan by making ourselves too available. Sylvia replaced the cap on the marker with a firm snap. Done. And I'm very uncomfortable with this part of the plan. This sitting around and waiting to get jumped part. Marin and Jack exchanged a glance. They couldn't predict exactly how the Coven would strike next. Unanswered questions meant gaps, weaknesses in their plan. But the plan was in place and rolling forward. Some fire and a little sleight of hand, and hopefully, Sylvia would be in the clear. Jack didn't understand how Sylvia was protected from the flames, but Marin said it could be done. And having witnessed the complete control his dragon sidekick had displayed on a previous case, lighting up an entire room in seconds, destroying the contents but nothing else, then extinguishing the flames and leaving the charred remains cool to the touch in an equally short amount of time, yeah, Jack believed she could keep Sylvia safe. Jack? From her irritated tone, Jack guessed wasn't the first time Marin had called his name. Not good. He had to stay sharp. Yeah? You got something? Jack started to gather their trash. Not close, but approaching, Marin said. Definitely witch. I guess it's time. There are 3 of them, by the way. Sylvia stood up and grabbed the extended handle of the ice chest. You've got the ring? Jack asked. Without the warded ring that Arthur had created for them that morning, the plan would fail. Invisibility his ass. Well, there'd be no way to verify it worked because she couldn't put it on until she'd died. They were all placing a great deal of trust in Arthur. Sylvia pulled at the ribbon hanging around her neck and showed him the attached ring. When he nodded, she stuffed it back under her shirt. Marin stood up, scanning the surrounding area. Let's go. Briskly, her hand on Sylvia's elbow, Marin ushered her in the direction of the small wooded area about 50 yards from the table. That had been the point of choosing this particular area: food, a picnic bench, and a handy wooded area in which to disappear. Jack resisted the urge to actually cross his fingers as he jogged the few feet separating him from Marin and Sylvia. The short stretch to the woods seemed like a mile given their slow pace, and Jack still hadn't spotted their 3 pursuers. And there they were. Jack caught sight of 2 men and a woman over his right shoulder. All 3 were weaving with determination through the light crowd of midday foot traffic. Jack placed a hand on the middle of Sylvia's back. Just a little faster. She panted and almost tripped. I am not. She took a quick breath. I'm in terrible shape. Panic doesn't help. Jack glanced over his shoulder again. They weren't going to make the prearranged spot. You see that thick tree? The one with the low-hanging branch? Yes. That's where we're headed, Jack said. Jack! Marin shot him a worried look. It'll work. It has to. Jack tipped his head, indicating their pursuers. By the time they'd make it to the tree, one of the men and the woman were within 30 feet. Just as Jack slid behind the large tree, hugging close to Marin and Sylvia, the first salvo arrived. A glass shattered against the tree and a fog began to coalesce and rise from the ground. Water and earth. The fog is just fog, probably to obscure sight. Sylvia had caught her breath and spoke clearly. But, don't touch where that potion landed. I'm pretty sure it's a contact poison. Definitely not harmless. Wait, poison?
Jack said. Shit. Not harmless? Not harmless, in Sylvia speak, meant lethal. I don't remember any antidotes in your ice chest.
I said don't touch it, Sylvia snapped at him. What happened to the third man? I think he's a low-level water witch. No boiling your insides or drowning you in your own blood.
Sylvia spoke so matter-of-factly without any sign of strain it was disturbing. Jack wondered if that was key to keeping her calm, give her a task and keep her occupied, or discuss torture. She seemed really comfortable with torture, and poison, and fire.
Hey, Marin muttered. The fog. The third man.
Yeah, see if you can sense him in the woods. Jack turned to Sylvia and whispered in her ear, We need to make sure he's not blocking your exit. A loud, booming noise echoed through the small wood, and kept echoing. Jack sank slowly to the ground, the bark of the tree at his back digging into his flesh. That should hurt.
Tree! Poison!
A woman's voice in the background. Right. He shouldn't be touching the tree. God knew what that poison would do to him. Oh yeah, kill him. He tried to get up. Couldn't. Marin grabbed him and pulled him a few feet away. That was good. Poison was bad. She was saying something, but the echo wouldn't stop. Sylvia shoved a handful of weeds at him. She was digging into his shoulder, burning him. He tried to scramble away, couldn't move. Burning everywhere. His shoulder, and the smell, the noxious smell of burnt flesh. His nose filled with it. He gagged. The world wavered. Then Marin was holding his head between her hands, hard. He blinked away the sweat in his eyes.
Can you hear me?
Marin asked.
Yes.
Jack's voice sounded strange in his ears. Still holding his head, Marin said,
You've been shot. Sylvia stopped the bleeding.
Weeds. Jack wasn't sure what part weeds played. His muddled mind finally landed on the answer. Earth witch. Bleeding wound. Why was his brain so slow? And then he felt it. The fierce burning in his shoulder. He'd been shot. Marin had said.
The yarrow will keep the bleeding in check, and Marin's fried the shooter, but I need to...
Sylvia pulled out the ring from under her shirt.
Right.
Jack reached his right hand over to hold the plants in place on his shoulder. Only halfway there, and his vision swam. Marin, still holding his head, squeezed hard. Don't pass out, you jackass! Not until we're done!
Oh, honey,
Jack gasped as he inhaled.
I didn't know you cared.
Marin snarled something obscene, grabbing his right hand, and shoved it over the bunch of weeds on top of his wound. Jack couldn't manage pressure, but he could hold them in place, for now.
The other two?
Inspecting the crispy remains of the shooter, but likely not much longer. Marin's attention was riveted to some distant spot in the woods. And local law enforcement is a problem. The fog had dissipated, so the water witch had either lost his concentration or couldn't hold the fog for long. So, it's time to burn shit already. How do we get them closer? Jack asked. Marin raised an eyebrow. You sit there and try not to bleed. Besides, looks like they're headed this way already. Jack couldn't see shit from his vantage point, but even if Marin couldn't see them approach, she'd feel it. What he wouldn't give for that ability. They'd get closer. Sylvia would misfire a fire potion and appear to be consumed by flames. Marin would cover her in a protective layer of flame. Jack still didn't actually get how that would work. And Sylvia would put on the ring and slip quietly away behind a wall of flames. Simple. But Sylvia's escape route had changed, and the angle of pursuit was different, changing the visual effect. And the cops might be on the way, and he was bleeding, barely, but still, and immobilized on the ground. Shit. Marin and Sylvia must have been talking while Jack had zoned out. Sylvia rolled her stash closer to Jack.
We need you to throw the fire flask.
She pulled out a tiny perfume bottle and knelt next to him. Jack knew he looked like shit. He felt like death. Are you nuts? But he swallowed as Sylvia tipped the liquid down his throat. As she held his head and Jack swallowed the last drop, Sylvia said,
Not nuts and mostly harmless.
She leaned in and whispered fiercely in his ear,
Thank you.
then stepped away. It was heartfelt. Jack knew it. It wasn't the words. It was the look in her eyes. Sad, hopeful, exhausted, grateful, all mixed together.
Angles have changed, and I need to make a little more fire. That stuff should perk you up.
Marin grabbed the chemistry set-looking flask, the one that basically exploded on contact with air and would set a good 5x5 area on fire. Handing it to Jack, she said very quietly,
Fire on 3.
Jack pulled his right hand away from his shoulder, waiting for the pain, the burn, the fading vision. Nothing. He wrapped his good hand carefully around the neck of the flask. Marin held up one finger, 2 fingers. Jack could see movement out of the corner of his eye. 3 fingers, and an explosion of fire. Tears ran down Jack's face as smoke stung his eyes. He cringed away from the flames only a few feet away. He couldn't see Marin. He couldn't see Sylvia. Had she remembered the ring? Jack started to stand. He should have a few minutes left on that potion he'd swallowed. The world wobbled, his vision narrowed. But he focused on breathing, beating back the nausea. Finally, the world assumed a more stable aspect. Minor planning fail. How the hell was he supposed to stop the 2 pissed-off witches just on the other side of the wall of flames? Chapter 7. Jack reviewed his mental notes for some potion that would help him, but those notes were crap. Labels. Shit, he hoped that would work. He leaned down, expecting to feel faint, but found he was surprisingly clear-headed. Digging through the chest, Jack grinned as he realized that the 2 witches were still after him. Closing the gap, in fact. Not chasing Marin or the now invisible Sylvia. Maybe their little gambit had worked. He pulled out the red plastic container that had freaked out Sylvia in the airport. Marked in clear capital letters, the container read, Not harmless. Jack choked in pain as a laugh escaped. In smaller letters, there were instructions to throw very far. No mention of what it did or how fire would affect it. It was a gamble. Jack checked the progress of his witch buddies, and that was the tipping point. They just about found their way around the edge of the flames and were closing in. Plastic wouldn't break, so he averted his head and opened the container. Inside were 4 tiny bundles. Net sachets filled with God only knew what and tied with little pink ribbons. He picked one up, careful to only touch the netting at the top, and closed the container again. He ducked out from behind the tree that hid him from the witches and hurled the pink ribbon sachet. Light flashed. The ground rumbled. Jack fell back against a tree, clutching the red plastic container. As debris fell from the sky, Jack hunted some sound past the ringing in his ears. But the world was silent. He looked down at the container in his hand. Hell, the cops were definitely coming now. Jack took a breath, steeled himself for a possible witch zap, and stuck his head out for a look. One still coming. He opened the container and grabbed a second sachet grenade. As he tossed the second grenade, he realized the guy was probably too close. Blackness engulfed him. Jack gained consciousness suddenly. Rhythmic punches of pain shot through his body. Acrid smoke filled his nose and burned his throat. His head felt like it was going to explode. "Jesus, put me down!" he tried to yell. but a weak croak emerged, and his breath huffed out on a gasp with every other word. Slung across Marin's shoulders in a fireman's carry, he bounced with each jogging step. No answer, and the feeling of his skin, muscle, bones shredding with each step wouldn't stop. Still, quiet. No more thudding of his own pulse pounding in his ears. He opened his eyes, took a clean breath of air. He must have passed out again, because he could see the road where only trees were before. They moved to the road, but in a gliding, smooth motion. A silver Mercedes. Nice. He really shouldn't get blood on.
Jack, come on, wake up.
Marin's voice drifted further, closer, and further. A vice closed around Jack's finger. Ah! His eyes flew open. Marin let go of his hand.
The healer needs you awake.
What?
Jack was wedged into the back seat corner of a large car with Marin to his right. The car door was open and a man was leaning in. Jack tried to shift in his seat.
Shit!
Pain. A gunshot. Bleeding. Now he remembered. He held himself as still as possible. Too late. The wound throbbed to the beat of his heart. He shivered as a gentle breeze brushed against his wet skin. It was dark outside. The man at the door leaned in further.
I have to touch you to evaluate and start the healing.
Jack winced, but he forced a response from his lips.
Yep. Permission given.
Freaking healers and their bizarre code of ethics. Maybe if he got a little pissed about that, he could distract himself as the man poked.
Fuck!
Jack yelled as the guy pulled material away from the wound. Jack panted and tried to catch his breath, make his ribs move less, be still. A cool wash of numbness started in his shoulder and flowed to his weakened arm, his throbbing head, his aching and exhausted body. Jack closed his eyes and almost cried in relief. He took a pain-free breath and then another. He opened his eyes.
Thank you.
The man, dark-headed but with a bright red beard, nodded without letting his attention waver from Jack's wound. Jack didn't want to say, but it had to be said.
Marin,
It's fine. Marin's lips were thin, her face tight.
It could easily have been me. I lost the shooter. That's why he got the shot off.
Jack coughed out a laugh. Only one, though.
Yeah.
The healer stepped away.
I can't do much more. Mundanes are harder to heal. No magic to borrow.
The guy looked embarrassed, like he'd failed. Jack was confused.
I feel a lot better. I mean, seriously better.
The healer shook his head. Another man approached the open door of the car. Arthur. Where did Arthur come from?
Oh, this is your car?
It is,
Arthur said.
What Ryan is trying to tell you is that your improved state won't last long. You need to see another healer when you get back to Austin.
He needs blood. Ryan, apparently that was his healer's name, gave him a hard look.
Magic can't replace what's not there. You've lost a decent amount of blood. Even with your witch's poultice, all the movement opened up your wound again. I can't go to the hospital. Any chance you have some saline? Wouldn't that get me by?
Jack looked between Ryan and Arthur, trying to gauge how big of a problem his injury was going to be.
It might, but I don't have any. And honestly, your witch didn't do you any favors when she juiced you with, uppers? The strength potion? Not a great idea for a guy who's leaking blood.
Ryan scanned the horizon. Jack looked around. They were parked in the middle of nowhere.
Where are we? New Hampshire, Arthur replied. And when Jack gave him a curious look, he shrugged. I'm retired. I have a car. It wasn't a problem. Besides, I'm not particularly worried about pissing off the locals. I've decided Salem isn't really a good fit for me.
Great. Jack's guilt ratcheted up about 5 notches. They'd put their friendly, retired spellcaster in the shit with the local coven reps. Not that the guy seemed remotely concerned. Ryan reached out and touched Jack's shoulder again. If I can't convince you to go to the hospital, then get to another healer as soon as you can. I've done everything I can. Jack could almost feel the magic flowing from the man as he gave Jack one last healing push. Certainly, he could feel the effects. He reached out and firmly shook the man's hand. Thank you. Ryan nodded and walked a short distance to a parked truck. As the threesome loaded into the car, Arthur driving and Marin in the back with him, Jack tried to fit all the pieces together in his head. The entire afternoon was a tangle of partial memories and flashes of intense pain. Sylvia's safe? I think so. Either our sleight of hand worked, or I completely fired her. Marin lifted her hands. I'm kidding, Jack. I didn't fry the client. She's fine. Safely uncooked and on her way. Whether she makes it to the cargo ship, that's another question. Jack winced. We didn't have a choice, but cargo sure as hell wouldn't have made my top 10. Arthur caught Jack's gaze in the rearview mirror. I doubt the Coven would consider it in their top 10 either. You're lucky you found a ship headed the right direction. Jack tipped his head back against the seat cushion. 2 weeks to Germany, then from Germany to... Jack stopped himself. Arthur was trustworthy, but there was no reason to burden him with the information. Eventually, after a few stops and possibly an IPPC debrief, Sylvia would make her way to England. With some luck, we'll hear from her in a month. Marin frowned. Says the dragon who didn't get shot. The client's tail was shaken and means provided for a relatively safe getaway. Mission accomplished. Despite his words, Jack couldn't suppress a desire for more closure. Not knowing sucked. It hadn't taken them long to get to the Manchester airport. After a pit stop at a gas station where Jack changed his shirt and washed up, he and Marin boarded a perfectly normal economy-class flight to Dallas, where Jack's buddy Max would meet them. One brief text and Max had agreed to fly into Dallas, pick up Jack's car from the tiny airport outside of town, stock up on some basic medical supplies, and meet them at the DFW airport. With any luck, a little saline and some painkillers would keep Jack going long enough to make it home to Austin. And it almost happened. Marin and Jack's connection in Chicago was uneventful, and the first half of the flight was pretty good. That's how Jack remembered it. Marin said he looked airsick and the flight attendant checked on him 3 times. But Jack knew with certainty that the second half hadn't gone to plan because he remembered drifting in and out of awareness several times, and Marin being pissed at him and poking him a lot, and finally Max carting him around in a wheelchair at the airport. Yeah, not so great. When Jack woke up the next morning in the hospital, Marin was slumped in a chair near his bed. He didn't think that was allowed, but it was good to see a familiar face, so he wasn't complaining. He desperately needed a pee. That had to be a good sign for a guy that had major blood loss recently. As he got up to hunt down a toilet, Marin's head jerked up. She rubbed her eyes. You look better. Marginally, but at least you can stand on your own. Yeah. Hey, what happened to my stash? Marin covered a massive yawn. You're welcome, Jack. It was no problem carrying your ass through the woods, or finding a healer in the middle of backwoods New Hampshire, or faking my way through a flight with a recently gunshot nitwit, or convincing the hospital staff to treat your serious anemia without running 20 diagnostic tests. No problem at all, but yes, I did take care of your stash. Arthur's mailing it. I did let him pick something out as a thanks for packing it up and getting it here. Jack couldn't restrain a massive grin. He even leaned down and hugged her like a madman. until he remembered he was wearing a hospital gown and had to pee like a racehorse.
Hey, before you run off, Sylvia made it on board. One of Max's buddies works at a travel agency, and she has a friend who knows this guy. You know Max. He worked his connections.
Jack grinned. That's all right. By the time he got back, Merritt had thrown his clothes on the bed and made arrangements for him to check.
Against your doctor's recommendation, by the way. They still want to run a bunch of tests. They don't understand why you were so dehydrated, had low blood pressure and anemia, but couldn't find signs of recent trauma or other signs of blood loss.
I'm a medical mystery.
No, you're an accident-prone toddler who needs a high-level healer on staff.
Jack could hardly argue, given the number of times he'd needed a healer recently. Yeah, but a spellcaster sure as hell wouldn't hurt either. You're driving, right? Marin rolled her eyes and jingled the keys in her hand at him.
You drive like an old lady.
But Jack could see the worry behind her teasing. She must not be too pissed off at him. But that didn't lift the weight that had firmly settled over his chest. Epilogue. Several days had passed since he and Marin had returned from Boston. They'd received a wire from a numbered account. Sylvia, of course. Jack had worried. He couldn't agree that she was mostly harmless, but at least she knew where to draw the line. And the woman had mad skills in the garden. But one question kept nagging at Jack. There'd been an unsettled, uncomfortable feeling between him and Marin since they'd returned. He wasn't sure if asking would push the atmosphere at the junk shop into an even murkier place, or maybe clear the air. Either way, the question buzzed in his mind like an annoying gnat, and he wanted the answer. He stepped into the doorway of his office, and he asked, "Why do you work for me?" Marin dropped the file folder in her hand back into the filing cabinet, and then she turned to look at Jack. But she didn't reply. Jack walked into the office. "You don't need the money." Although not a question, Marin shook her head slowly in response. Her reluctance fueled his curiosity. Or maybe it was his anger. He didn't want to need her, but after several brushes with death, it was clear he did. "You have better contacts, you're stronger, faster, you have magic." Jack shoved his hand through his hair. "It's your world, not mine. So, why do you work for me when you can do my job better than I can?" Marin sank into Jack's chair. "You're wrong." But she didn't explain. "That's not good enough. Maybe we've only been together a few months, but the shit we've been through, the number of times you've dragged both our asses out of his messes, his bad choices." It made him even angrier to acknowledge it, but he wasn't about to lie to himself. He wouldn't be that guy. "I haven't worked out kinks, and I don't know the best ways to navigate in this world, but you still stay. Why?" "Jack." Her eyes shone bright, but she rubbed at the corners before anything resembling a tear could fall. She snorted. "Even my dad doesn't make me cry. Thanks for that." Her head fell back against the chair, and she stared at the ceiling. She groaned, then lifted her head. "Dragons don't really do their own thing. The entire clan is tied to McClelland's security company, in one way or another, and young dragons don't leave home." Jack settled into one of the client chairs and kicked his legs out in front of him. "But you're young, and you don't work for McClelland, so apparently you can do your own thing." "The jury's out. We live in a precarious place. The world moves by very fast, and we have to stay in touch with time as it passes." Jack nodded. "You've said before, some dragons go mad when they stop living in the present. But what better way to stay in touch than to live amongst the little people?" Marin curled her lip. "It's not funny.
You're an impetuous shit, but I still like you enough not to want to see your life flash by in a series of short moments. I guess that's how the older dragons experience time, toward the end. Or if they lose touch with time.
I'm still not seeing the problem. You bucked a cultural trend and left the nest.
Supposedly, we don't do well alone, outside the clan.
Marin shrugged. Jack narrowed his eyes, peering at her. She sighed.
I can't work in an office. It's not the work, but the sameness, the routine, the small rooms. And I couldn't start a business by myself. Show up to an empty building, go weeks without seeing the same person twice. It's just not for me.
She looked up at the ceiling briefly, praying to the dragon gods for patience, and then said,
So this, the junk shop, spy, this job, it's a real option for me. And that's down to you.
Are you seriously telling me that I'm your link to good mental health, dragon style? She wrinkled her nose.
Let's just say you're one option.
It sounded like she needed him too. He could breathe, really breathe, for the first time in a while. Jack nodded. Got it. Let me know if another option pops up. After a moment, he added, I like having you here. He stood up, past time to end this particular conversation. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow.
The end. This has been Spirelli Paranormal Investigations, Episode 3. Written by Kate Beret. Narrated by Roberto Scarlato. Copyright 2015 by Catherine G. Cobb. Production copyright 2017 by Catherine G. Cobb.